Hello YouTube. Today I'll be talking about Lord John Emmerich Edward Dahlberg Acton, 1st Baron Acton, that is Lord Acton, and his very famous aphorism that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. There's actually quite a bit more context, but let's begin with a little biographical information. He was born 10th January 1834 and died 19th of June 1902. Came from a noble birth, an Englishman from a wealthy and famed family. He was an important Catholic liberal, which in the UK back then represented something more along the lines of a small government, laissez-faire view on political economy, combined with a progressive view on social issues such as religious freedom, freedom of speech, etc. In short, they were more or less the party of freedom, at least compared to the Conservative Party. His main achievements were his many essays of history, as he was an avid historian. Interestingly, he never published any books, but instead attempted to write a huge history of liberty, which was probably the most ambitious project that I've ever heard of, and has been often, to the point of cliche, been referred to as the greatest book never written. It would have mixed political theory, exacting historical research, theological studies, sociology, and many other subjects together to paint a tapestry of the dialectic between power on the one hand and freedom on the other, and the various ways this discourse is crystallized into specific historical episodes. I put discourse in quotes, of course, because tyranny may be described in part by reference to its tendency to silence discourse and enforce insularity of opinion. The book was never finished. I'd guess something like that would take several lifetimes to actually get completed. But in the course of the attempt, he amassed a famously impressive library and wrote a ton of essays and corresponded with many of the important people of his time. It was said of him that he had read everything worth reading and knew everyone worth knowing. He's a fascinating figure in his own right, but I'm not here today to give a biography of Lord Acton, so let's go ahead and move on. Now, our aphorism today is one of the most famous phrases in English, which is astounding since it comes actually from a somewhat obscure letter he wrote to a friend and colleague of his, not an essay or lecture at Cambridge where he taught towards the end of his life. Back then, correspondence was much more thorough since it wasn't instantaneous, and there was a lot of value to be found in the old letters of lettered people because of this. The phrase was used in a correspondence with historian and Bishop Mandell Crichton while discussing a review Acton had written for Crichton's History of the Papacy. The letter itself was polemical, yet erudite, which, by the way, is typical for Acton. Studying him for this video gave me a lot more respect for him. I think he's actually kind of underrated. But anyway, in it, he criticized Crichton for basically walking on eggshells about the whole Inquisition part of the Church's history and the persecutorial adventures of the papacy generally, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries. Acton writes at one point, quote, "What amazes and disables me is that you speak of the papacy not as exercising a just severity, but as not exercising any severity. You do not say, these misbelievers deserve to fall into the hands of these torturers and fire the faggots, but you ignore, you even deny, at least implicitly, the existence of the torture chamber and the stake." Now obviously fire the faggots here is meant in the old sense of lighting wood on fire. He's talking about burning people alive at the stake. And it goes on in like manner throughout the letter. I'd like to take a moment to quickly overview Acton's philosophy of history and ethics as discussed in his introductory lecture at Cambridge. It's probably the most accessible and clear statement he made on this. The reasons for this in terms of today's aphorism will, I hope, become clear afterwards. The two main points are as follows. First and foremost, Acton expressed his view that, essentially and in principle, there is no excuse for people in his time, or the present generally, whenever the present happens to be, to not know right from wrong. And importantly, his appraisal of historical figures shows no mercy. Acton expects us to view historical figures with the full measure of justice in mind, and to not accept diluted coin, so to speak. I'll allow Acton to speak for himself somewhat at length here. It says, "We cannot afford to wantonly to lose the sight of great men and memorable lives, and are bound to store up objects for admiration as far as may be, for the effect of implacable research is constantly to reduce their number. No intellectual exercise, for instance, can be more invigorating than to watch the working of the mind of Napoleon, the most entirely known as well as the ablest of historic men. In another sphere, it is the vision of a higher world to be intimate with the character of Fenelon, the cherished model of politicians, ecclesiastics, and men of letters, the witness against one century and precursor of another, the advocate of the poor against oppression, of liberty in an age of arbitrary power, of tolerance in an age of persecution, of the humane virtues among men accustomed to sacrifice them to authority, the man of whom one enemy says that his cleverness was enough to strike terror, and another that genius poured in torrents from his eyes. For the minds that are greatest and best alone furnish the instructive examples. A man of ordinary proportion or inferior metal knows not how to think out the rounded circle of his thought, how to divest his will of its surroundings and to rise above the pressure of time and race and circumstance, to choose the star that guides his course, to correct and test and assay his convictions by the light within, and with a resolute conscience and ideal courage to remodel and reconstitute the character which birth and education gave him. In other words, people can always be better than they are, and the best people are those who hold this mirror about our natures as human beings while sternly refusing to look away from it or forgetting that they are also in the field of that mirror. We are the mistake-making yet constantly changing animal. And then second, the lecture gives us a sense of just how broad and deeply Acton viewed the history of the world, and also anticipated the current deluge of information about the past. When Acton was writing and researching, the documentation of many nations and institutions were just beginning to be known or revealed and declassified, and so on. He says, quote, "We are still at the beginning of the documentary age, which will tend to make history independent of historians, to develop learning at the expense of writing, and to accomplish a revolution in other sciences as well," unquote. It is startling indeed to think of the massive advancements in this kind of sense that have occurred since he said those words in a lecture hall in Cambridge so long ago. If he only knew about the internet, Google Docs, file sharing, WikiLeaks, and all these things that we take for granted that they serve as modern repositories or tributaries of information flow. A bit later he says, quote, "For our purpose, the main thing to learn is not the art of accumulating material, but the sublimer art of investigating it, of discerning truth from falsehood and certainty from doubt. It is by solidity of criticism, more than by the plenitude of erudition, that the study of history strengthens and straightens and extends the mind. And the accession of the critic in the place of the indefatigable compiler, of the artist in colored narrative, the skilled limner of character, the persuasive advocate of good, or other, causes, amounts to a transfer of government, to a change of dynasty in the historic realm," unquote. Towards the end of the lecture, there's a section where he throws out a succession of aphorisms, most or maybe all of which are fairly standard advice for young people in a school setting. But after all this, he finally also says, quote, "But the weight of opinion is against me when I exhort you never to debase the moral currency or to lower the standard of rectitude, but to try others by the final maxim that governs your own lives, and to suffer no man and no cause to escape the undying penalty which history has the power to inflict on wrong," unquote. I've quoted all that extensively because I want everyone watching this to be sensitive to this overarching view of Acton's views now that we go into the full context of our aphorism, "Power corrupts." Remember that he wrote his famous phrase, which, by the way, was a sentiment not really originating with himself, but was apparently somewhat diffused throughout many learned people, though it seems that Acton's letter popularized it by way of the incidental publication of that letter to Crichton, in response to his history of the papacy, which Crichton had essentially ignored many of the ignoble or intolerant things the church was involved in the past. So Acton writes this in his letter, which includes, and this includes the full context of the quote, that I think not very many people have bothered to read, so that's kind of why I made this video. Acton writes, quote, "I cannot accept your canon that we are to judge Pope and King unlike other men, with a favorable presumption that they did no wrong. If there is any presumption, it is the other way against the holders of power, increasing as the power increases. Historic responsibility has to make up for the want of legal responsibility. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence and not authority. Still more when you superadd the tendency or the certainty of corruption by authority. There is no worse heresy than that the office sanctifies the holder of it. That is the point at which the negation of Catholicism and the negation of liberalism meet and keep high festival, and the end learns to justify the means. You would spare these criminals for some mysterious reason. I would hang them higher than Haman for reasons of quite obvious justice. Still more, still higher for the sake of historical science," unquote. Haman, for those who don't know, by the way, was an ancient antagonist of the Jews, the ancient Jews, something of an archetype of evil for them, who built his own gallows unknowingly and was eventually hung on them. So, a few things, and then I'll stop because I feel this video's already gone on pretty long. First, that one of the main issues with power and authority is that, by its very nature, power is institutionally fortified against rational criticism, via insularity and distance from the vulgar people who are considered its jurisdiction. It's not that power per se is bad, it is that most power is illegitimately wielded, because it is wielded in a way that is disconnected from its true purpose, which is, broadly speaking, should be the advancement of truth and justice. Instead, power tends to be wielded for its own sake, like a drug, the ends justify the means at first, but then the means become the end. Power for its own sake becomes all there is to a lot of these people at the higher echelons of human existence. And this has been played out over and over and over again throughout history. And it's something that cannot be merely wiped away by an appeal to different times or different cultures. Second, that those who criticize the abuses of power are almost always maligned by polite society. Acton himself was an ardent Catholic and was almost excommunicated, and his good friend and mentor, Dollinger, actually was excommunicated. But regardless of the risks, it's important to criticize the institutions to which we belong the most. As he wrote to Crichton, quote, "That is the point at which the negation of Catholicism and the negation of liberalism meet and keep high festival, and the ends learn to justify the means," unquote. What he's saying here is that by ignoring the faults of those institutions we hold dear, we also negate the institutions themselves, since by their lack of proper reform when it is needed, they have betrayed their own stated purposes, and they've become perverse abominations that help no one, except those at the top. In other words, it's not criticism that destroys institutions, it's their refusal to be consistent with themselves and with truth and justice that destroys them and disintegrates them. It's like bad employees. When a place is being run wisely, bad employees don't get fired, they fire themselves, right? So to speak. So it's the same with institutions, with all institutions, which topple themselves either in practice or with regard to the view of which history shall regard them. My last comment here is simply to note that it has become fashionable to attempt to be neutral in regard to the study of history, but the more I think about it and read about the practice of history itself, the less I am apt to agree with this attitude, especially after reading a bunch of Acton for this video. Bias is not itself any kind of indictment against an argument. It's usually a non sequitur anyway. But nonetheless, we must be exacting in our research and, of course, as accurate as possible in all the relevant senses, including morally. And I think Acton said it best at the very end of his inaugural lecture on history, this is where I'll leave you. Quote, "Whatever a man's notions of these later centuries are, such, in the main, the man himself will be. Under the name of history, they cover the articles of his philosophic, his religious, and his political creed. They give his measure, they denote his character. And, as praise is the shipwreck of historians, his preferences betray him more than his aversions. Modern history touches us so nearly, it is so deep a question of life and death, that we are bound to find our own way through it and to owe our insight to ourselves. The historians of former ages, unapproachable for us in knowledge and in talent, cannot be our limit. We have the power to be more rigidly impersonal, disinterested, and just than they, and to learn from undisguised and genuine records to look with remorse upon the past and to the future with assured hope of better things, bearing this in mind, that if we lower our standard in history, we cannot uphold it in church or state." Unquote. Well, until next time, keep your wits about you. Peace.